Wisp Sports Radio, the voice of women in sport.
Hello, and thank you for downloading Season 1, Episode 3 of The Mind Matters with me, Chris Stafford, and
Jenny Susker.
how are you, Jenny?
I'm well, Chris. How are you?
So far, so good. Our topic today, I think, is going to apply to a lot of athletes who are out there who are transitioning from an active athletic career, maybe professional, to a new beginning, really, for them. Just sum this up for us and tell us why you think this is an important stage and something that should be addressed, meaningfully, and to help people with resources to transition.
Well, transition for anyone can be challenging. And transitioning from being an athlete, whether professional, collegiate, international, Olympic, is incredibly challenging. And I think it really comes down to our relationship to identity, which identity is a whole big ball of wax. But as a former athlete, when I think back to when I, quote unquote, retired from swimming at the ripe old age of 22, it was incredibly challenging. It was challenging for me, and I watched the swimmers before me and the swimmers after me go through their retirement phases and steps, and just how difficult it was. And I don't think that it is, I think we're paying a little bit more and more attention to it now, but I don't think it's got one way to approach it, which is part of the challenge. So every athlete is going to go through it at some point. Even if they remain athletic or even competitive throughout their lives, they're going to transition from a level of sport and being a performance athlete to a lower one at some point.
Whilst they are professional athletes, they often don't realize that sport is not defining who they are. They define who they are, but they've only known that identity for so many years, and it's been all-consuming. And it's also a very selfish lifestyle in a way and career, because they have to be so focused. It's all about themselves, and it's all about their own, routine, their training, their life, their performance. It's all about them. And then suddenly it's not.
Yeah, that can be a pretty stark reality check for a lot of athletes. So from a psychological perspective, thinking about athletic identity and identity, the interesting thing is that being an athlete and coming up through the youth athletic competitive experience, if you follow psychological theory, like while you are turning into this amazing athlete is while your psyche is ripe and really seeking identity development. So Erik Erikson is the one that all the psychologists refer to. And his stage of identity confusion during adolescence is really where we sort of leave that moment of childhood where your identity is basically given to you. When you are young, pre-teen, pre-adolescent, you're sort of at the whim of others. Okay, here's what your parents do. Here's where your parents live. Here's what your parents look like. Here's the sports that your parents played. Here's the sports that are available to you based on where you live, how much money you have. And so it's all very given to you. Then as you become an adolescent, you get this opportunity to start to choose. And that time, those teenage years, is also when our bodies change. And so your athletic ability changes. So that's typically a make or break period of time for young athletes, because they'll grow into their more adult bodies. And then that will determine whether or not they're going to make it, So I've heard of gymnasts, young women, who just have these crazy, incredible growth spurts, and then they're just too tall. So it's an interesting time. So it reinforces this solo athlete identity that you were mentioning.
Identity obviously is something that we evolve with as we grow and how we develop as an individual, depending on so many external factors, of course, but also internal factors too. But in terms of what you might be processing when you realize that you're going to retire from being a professional, and that in some sports can be the majority of your life. You know, in some sports you can just keep going. But give us some idea of what you need to consider in terms when you are an athlete, not just what are you going to do after you retire from being an athlete, but what that means to you as a person, who you are, who is left there when the athlete is taken away.
That's such a good question, and it's such a hard topic to really come to a powerful place when you are being a competitive athlete. So I think back to my own experience, and I swam very competitively, and I swam at UCLA, a fantastic university. Not only was it a top 10 Division I program when I was there, but one of the top universities in the country, right? So you have all these opportunities to you, and I focused on none of them. I focused on swimming, and that was it. And when I was done swimming, I sort of was left standing there with my, palms facing upward going, well, what now? And I had always, always, always been the swimmer. I swam when I was young. And so forever and forever, I was the swimmer. I mean, for decades, I would be introduced to any of my parents' friends or people in their lives. And, oh, you're the swimmer. I mean, and it happened to me, well into my 30s and 40s. I'd meet my parents' friends. Oh, you're the swimmer, like still. And so part of that identity was my father's, for sure. That's how he saw me. And so creating a culture of that being an athlete isn't the only thing, I think, is part of the importance to it. And a lot of programs now are starting to see that as being more and more important, and that athletes can have things outside of their lives other than just sport and being an athlete. And so your culture, the type of sport, your family, those influences, but having someone, like you need someone in your life to say to you, hey, what else are you? Right? Because we have this big question, who are you? And it's interesting if you listen to how people introduce themselves or even reflect upon how you introduce yourself, your relationship to your identity comes out through that. Like, so think about that. Like, how do you introduce yourself, Chris?
Yeah, well, it's a good question because often the response to that is not who you are, but what you do. A lot of people would immediately refer to their profession, whatever it may be, or their, maybe they're just a mother. I say just a mother, but maybe that's their role in life, or a wife.
Right. But look at how we see that. Yeah.
So what does that tell us about ourselves when we put ourselves down in that way too? But on the other hand, if you're a professional athlete and maybe you've been very successful professional athlete, that's the first thing that you will tell people because you'll want them to know what your highest achievement was in the sport, perhaps. Oh, I'm an Olympic champion or whatever it may be.
Yeah, it's really hard, so the part of the identity development that we go through psychologically is really, just trying to, listen, at the core of it, we're all just trying to be special and important and feel connected. And that's a whole other much deeper conversation when we start to get into ego and ego strength. But our identity is a reflection of that. And if you think about it, if you're listening to this, think about how you identify and the people that you identify with. So our identity is very, very influenced by our surroundings, our environment, the culture that we grow up in, the culture that we choose to traffic in, and then the culture that we go to willingly and by choice as we become adults and leave competitive sport. And so there's always a blessing and a curse with regards to that. So thinking about, okay, well, who am I? And am I just one-dimensional? And that's where athletes have the most trouble with their transition into retirement from sport, with whatever that looks like. It's because they've had this one-dimensional view of themselves. And so working to create a multidimensional view of the self, it really supports athletic retirement. So, and I know in the program that I came from, our coach, Cindy Gallagher, was very highly influenced by John Wooden, right? Of course, UCLA. And John Wooden was really masterful at helping his basketball players see themselves as more than just a basketball player. He's very, very committed to helping them grow their culture, their character, and their identity beyond basketball. And so he paved the way for that. There's, one of the sports that really struggles with this in the United States is the NFL, the National Football League. And it's a very, very wealthy sport, very generative in terms of lots and lots of players, lots and lots of teams, lots and lots of money. But there's a crazy statistic that 78% of NFL players go bankrupt within 2 years of retirement. Now, the average lifespan in the NFL is actually only 3 years, but it's still significant amounts of money that they don't know how to manage and that they don't know how to deal with. And so their identities are always, Pee-wee football, which is I'm going to play in the NFL and win the Super Bowl and make millions and millions of dollars. But then what else is there? And how else do you develop that? And what I see lately is a little bit more of the contribution of diversity into identity development. If you look at the Williams sisters, their identity is multifaceted, multidimensional. So Serena, she's not just, hopefully will pass Margaret Court in the number of Grand Slam championships at 24. Hopefully she'll get to that. And she's doing it since becoming a wife and a mother and coming back and being an entrepreneur and a fashion setter, all these different things. So for her, tennis is an element, which I think is incredibly powerful. Same thing with Venus. She has an incredibly powerful and successful company as an entrepreneur and really works hard to foster that part of herself.
I think there are more people that are doing that now, though, aren't they? They realize that they have to prepare for life after their active career as an athlete. So they are preparing themselves. They are exploiting opportunities that come with success and sponsorship and media attention. And if they're savvy enough, they start to build a business based on the success and their name and their fame. Right, and that makes all the sense in the world to do that. So the transition for them is that much easier. And hopefully, say with somebody like a tennis player, it's more by choice than by injury, for example, causing them to have to retire. So that for them is a smooth transition. But for those that are not prepared for it, that don't know what that looks like. I mean, at the end of the day, when they hang up their boots or the racket or whatever it may be, there's a lot of loss attached to that, isn't there?
Tremendous. So it's interesting. When I was working on my dissertation, I was looking at the psychological impact of athletic injury, and I was looking at severe athletic injury, so either season or career-ending athletic injury. And this was about 1998, and all of the research, the only research that I could find at that time, compared the transition or the impact of that type of athletic injury, either season or career ending, to grief and loss models, from death and dying. And so and the severity is not to be undercut. I mean, it truly is. I've worked with many, many athletes who have had career-ending injuries. And the impact of that, the sudden acute nature of that loss, is incredible and terribly difficult to work through, process, and get to the other side of. And, when you have that strength of identity as an athlete, as a competitive athlete, and to lose that, whether suddenly through an injury or expected, rather, expectedly through retirement, like for instance, the end of your collegiate career, your athletic eligibility, or it's just time. The challenges are still really difficult. And so I would approach it, or I try to approach it with the people that I've worked with or talked to, similar as any other kind of transition, any other type of expectation of some sort of disruption. And one of the biggest things that we have missed historically is actually talking about it. And in much of the literature that exists now, there's an expectation that the transition, the psychological transition from retirement, takes 2 to 3 years. This is a significant period of time, but people don't go into their retirement or ending one career and beginning another with that type of expectation that it's going to take time and that they're going to need to talk about it. So it's interesting to think about it from that perspective. So if you think about how long it takes for a good athlete to get good, the 10,000 hour rule, that could be years, 10 years, 15 years. You look at a young athlete, starts playing their sport, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, doesn't get really good for 10 years, and then hopefully has a 5 to 10 year career, if that. Usually it's 3 to 6 years as a high performing athlete. So it takes a while to get good. So it's going to take a while to get good at something else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. It's not just a transition into what they're going to do next, but then actually to build that career, which, a lot of people start to do when they leave college or before that if they don't go to college. So, those people have had start. And these people that retire later in life, it's starting all over again. I mean, they may have not even have managed a bank account in the same way. They may not have had, responsibilities at home because everything was taken care of for them. And, they lose that sort of routine, that structure, the discipline in their life too. And I mean, I know they don't wake up one morning and it, mentally you're adjusting to that. So I'm curious as to what those other losses are and how people can, from this program, take away some tools to help them cope, how they should prepare for it.
So one of the biggest losses that people don't really think about when they retire from their sport is the loss of their physical activity, pressure, movement, pain. There's all these different things that are involved in being, having the physical life of a competitive athlete. So one of the very first things is that athletic or any type of athletic activity produces and releases serotonin, which is a very important neurotransmitter for feeling good. So a lot of athletes go from like, oh man, I'm so glad to not have to train, and then they don't do anything. And then they are missing this vital neurotransmitter to help you feel good in your brain. So there have been links to depression from athletic retirement and athletic injury based on just all of a sudden this new miss of not having the type of serotonin. So if you're going to transition from intense athletic performance training competition, either taper it down so that you're titrating yourself off of your physical endurance or performance training, or keep some sort of athletic activity in your life so that you can maintain this level of serotonin that you've been so used to. So that's one of the big things. That's like sort of a gimme, that's not incredibly challenging. And for most athletes to maintain some sort of physical routine is important. And that leads to the importance of the routine. So for a competitive athlete or high performing athlete, the routine is like their lives. They're so routinized, they don't really realize it. They're always told when to be, where to be, what to be, how to be, and for how long to be there. When I was a swimmer, it was, here's your workouts. Monday morning, swim. Monday afternoon, swim. After swimming, then weights. Then Tuesday morning, it was every week every single hour of every single day was planned. And a lot of times when athletes transition, they think, oh, this freedom is going to be awesome. I can do whatever the heck I want. And they are completely lost because they are so used to routine that they don't really have anywhere for their minds or bodies to go. So as you're preparing to transition, or if transition has been put upon you with an injury, create a new routine. It is very, very important to have the type of structure and determination in your new routine as you had in your old one. You know, a lot of athletes that transition, collegiate athletes that transition and then immediately go into graduate school do very well because they go from one very rigid, intense, purposeful structure into another. So that's a very, very important part of that. You're going to get a lot of time back when you retire from being a highly competitive athlete. And so being able to plan for that time, you know, Tiki Barber was a player in the NFL, great Hall of Fame player. And when he retired, he said he just didn't know what to do to fill his days. He had plenty of money. He had done well financially, and he had had a good financial support and planner. So he didn't need to work, but he wasn't ready for all the hours of not having anything to do. The other thing is that from a financial standpoint, a lot of athletes aren't prepared to now pay for the things that they've gotten for free for forever. So being a college or a professional athlete, like, you get everything for free: shoes, socks, sweats, you know, like, oh my goodness. Now, gosh, when I swam at UCLA, we got a sweatsuit, which we had to return. And then we got cotton sweats and a couple of t-shirts. And now they get multiple pairs of shoes and they get socks and they get everything. They probably never have to shop for clothing, except for if they, whatever they're going to wear when they go out. But they get so much stuff, right? And then they get free physio, right? Free doctors. So now they've entered the healthcare system that they never have. And it's something that they don't really anticipate or plan for the time. Most retiring athletes are going to have some physical repercussions from their time as an athlete. So being mindful and thinking of that.
So they're going along for years in their career, hopefully successfully, but at least reaching a level of success as a professional athlete. And then suddenly they drop off the cliff. Now, the mental impact of that is also huge, isn't it? And we see a lot of depression, a lot of athletes not knowing how to cope with this and really going into a slump. Some of them have a coaching job that continues, or they have other interests as well. But if they don't have something that's really meaningful in their life and gives them a new direction, a new pathway that they can transition to smoothly, they are not only just left with this big void in time, what do they do with all this time that they now have, but it does provide a void where they can slump into mentally, doesn't it?
It sure does. And, it's interesting to think about purpose and the high-performing athlete. So human beings are purpose-driven. I believe that once all of our physiological needs are met, what human beings need to survive is relationship and purpose, right? We're all seeking connection, and we're all seeking to be of value and make a difference somewhere inside of that connection. And the interesting thing about being a high-performing athlete is that it contributes. It actually is quite purposeful because we love sport. Human beings love sport. We love to watch sport. We love to play sport. It is intensely emotional. So the benefits of being an athlete, what you contribute to others, you watch the way that young athletes are inspired by their successful athletes that they follow. It brings great meaning. And so when an athlete's getting ready to retire, they have to begin to soul search to figure out, how am I going to replace that piece where I was making a difference for other people? They forget about that. the adoring fans aren't just adoring because, like you're so unbelievably handsome or something like that. They're adoring because of the way you make them feel or what your story or your journey inspires them to do with their story or their journey. And so spending some time, and it doesn't always come immediately, but looking for what am I going to replace that piece where I made a difference for people, I created value, I was connected, I was part of a team. How am I going to replace that? How am I going to now make a difference? And looking with that type of lens is very, very important because you go from playing a big game to not playing a game at all, and it leaves a big wide gap and hole and can be very painful. And I think that's where that next layer of identity can begin to develop. You said something about athletes having something. It doesn't, even if you have something, like I transitioned from my athletic career into coaching, which I ended up not loving, and then I transitioned from that into graduate school. And even though I had something to look forward to and I had a new purpose, it didn't keep me from experiencing the grief and the loss. And so you will have something new. And your new thing can be brilliant. You can be looking very, very forward to it. And at the same time, just remember to process and go through and grieve leaving your career, whether you're leaving it because it's time or because you had an injury or whatever the reason may be. Give yourself that time and that space. Find somebody to talk to about it, whether it's a mental health professional or a dear, dear friend or a coach or a mentor or a stranger on the subway. But find somebody to talk to about it, because when you get it out and start to communicate about it, that helps bring that relief and start the healing.
You mentioned earlier that word ego, which I think as a successful athlete, professional athlete, high-performance athletes, they develop with it an ego because they have been successful. They've been a role model for a lot of people, and it's that so heightened self-awareness, and unless they have a role for that after they retire, that's a big piece of it, I think, because they can't introduce themselves as Sue Smith, two-time Olympian, double Olympic champion, whatever. And I'm wondering how you compartmentalize that, and how, that's such a part of yourself and the personality that you've become as you've evolved in your identity. Is that something that lives with you?
Yeah, I think so, because, I'm thinking about myself first. When I went from being I was an All-American swimmer in Division I. I made a couple of national teams and went to Olympic trials. I swam at a very high level, and that was like really, really cool. And then then I found something to replace it with, to replace that challenge, that daily push. Being a competitive athlete, you are pushed every single day to a certain limit physically. I mean, you just are if you're training at that level. So finding something to replace that with, my graduate program and then going on to my career really helped with that. Now, the thing with the ego, the role that the ego plays in there is that if it becomes too much about you, then you'll lose a piece of the ability to have it be a contribution. Like the athletes where it's really, really, really about them. And they've been trained that way. And some sports are very much like that. Like I think about how difficult it was to watch Brett Favre retire and how difficult it was for him. But he had been brought up in this system where it was always all about him. And he was the star and he was the reason. And and so he didn't have anywhere else to go mentally. So his ego was the thing that was overpowering. And it wasn't because he's a bad guy. He was really, really well liked and loved and admired and respected and really, really good guy. But he was just missing something there. And so, being a swimmer, there was, back in the 80s, there wasn't the type of glory that there is now for it, and certainly no money in it. So I was by default forced to develop those other pieces. And so you just have to watch for that, depending on the sport and depending on the culture, how much of the self it becomes about, and then find ways. I think there's much more push for that now. Character in sport, developing character through youth sports. I think we're going to see a big shift in that going forward as people look to avoid those kind of retirement pitfalls and create a better model for while we're competing, to create a better athlete, a better sportsman, better sportsmanship, and then a better transition so that your life becomes not just about who you were as an athlete, but who you are as a person.
I guess we all need and want to be relevant, but sometimes you see athletes that have been so successful that they suddenly don't have that fan base anymore, and they are struggling in a way to stay relevant.
Yeah, that is, man, I wish I had a good answer for that. And you hear and see that all the time. And especially in the sports where there is huge fan base, like the national leagues, hockey, baseball, basketball, and football in the U.S., the footballers in Europe, the rugby players down under. When the fan base is that big and that huge, that's really hard, man. That is a hard replacement to create. And very few people make that leap. They go from being this great athlete to being like a broadcaster or a movie star or something like that, and still seeking or receiving that type of adoration on that level. But I think that's where that deeper work of the self, to look to what does your relevance really mean and what really creates relevance. The fact that I can throw a touchdown pass and make a stadium filled with 50,000 people go bonkers, how do you replace that? That's a tough one. And that's something that many athletes will continue to struggle with. But you can work to find ways to create an identity, develop a sense of self, so that comes from within instead of needing it to come from outside of the self.
Absolutely, and give back to the sport or the community in some way. But Jenny, any final thoughts on this topic?
Talk it out, talk about it. Don't keep it in. If you're struggling with this, talk about it, get it out. Our thoughts change a lot when they go from being silent and inside our heads to actually having to verbalize them. And that process is very transformative in and of itself. Get some guidance. So there is somebody, if you are struggling with an athletic transition or a retirement transition, somebody, I promise, somebody who has had this experience and who can help you navigate these waters. So don't suffer in silence. Don't struggle alone. Talk to somebody about it.
Great advice, as always, Jenny. Thank you for that. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks' time with another topic on the subject of sports psychology, the mental health, your mental health, the mental game, and, of course, the mind matters. Jenny, thanks again for joining me. Always great to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Hi, I'm Nicole Drought. I'm an Irish racing driver and a proud WISP ambassador. I support WISP because they help to increase visibility in women's sport. This is quite important because it'll help to encourage girls into sport if they have role models to look up to. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at Nicole Drought Racing. Thanks for listening and supporting WISP.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Until then, don't forget to follow Jenny on social media. Remind everybody how to find you, Jenny.
Well, Facebook, Dr. Jenny R. Susser, or drjenny.com, www.drjenny.com.
Easy enough. And of course, we are at WISP Sports. If you do want to drop us a line directly here and have any questions or comments about the show or any of the other shows, you can do that to info@wispsports.com. And we are on social media at WISP Sports, so feel free to share the love. And we'll see you around in 2 weeks' time back here on The Mind Matters. Thank you for listening.